Good morning. Here we are with Daily Devotions again. We're going to be using today a recommended reading from the same treasury of the treasury of daily prayer. After the New Testament reading, it recommends for Tuesday of Holy Week reading Lamentations chapter 2. Lamentations is a book that was written by the prophet Jeremiah, and he lived around 600 years, a little before, a little after, around 600 years before Jesus was born. And at this time, the Assyrian army had been taking over Israel bit by bit. They'd already conquered the northern kingdom by the time this book was written. Well, and actually, by the time Lamentations was written, they'd closed the noose around Jerusalem, finally besieged it, conquered the whole thing, wiped it out, destroyed the temple, the whole 9 yards. And so Lamentations is a book written by the prophet Jeremiah to lament what has happened to Jerusalem. It's basically 5 poems that mourn the loss of the city and all the destruction that happened and all the pain and loss of the experience, because Jeremiah was there to experience it. One thing you may notice through this whole thing, there's a bunch of different tragedies that are listed in the poem, and there's not really grace offered, at least not in this portion of it. There's not like oh, don't worry about it, it's going to be okay, or God still loves you even though you kind of screwed up or something like that. That will come later, but it's not in today's passage. And he doesn't exonerate them for their sins. God says this whole tragedy has come down on Israel because of their sins, because of the ways that they've refused to follow him. And now that's an application we don't make directly to our time because Jesus took all the punishment for sin that God has for us. But instead, we can still say that it is our sin that caused the brokenness of this fallen world in which we live. And so the tragedies that we experience in our lives are also the result of sin, though not in this same way the result of a specific sin, because we don't have a word from God saying this tragedy is because of this specific sin. But that was the case here for the Israelites. He said that because they had refused to listen to God's prophets, and they listened instead to false prophets, that's why this tragedy came over them. That's why God sent the Assyrians to conquer them, because they were running after other gods and not following the one true God. So, without further ado, here comes chapter 2. How the Lord in his anger has set the daughter of Zion under a cloud. He has cast down from heaven to earth the splendor of Israel. He has not remembered his footstool in the day of his anger. The Lord has swallowed up without mercy all the habitations of Jacob. In his wrath he has broken down the strongholds of the daughter of Judah. He has brought down to the ground in dishonor the kingdom and its rulers. He has cut down in fierce anger all the might of Israel. He has withdrawn from them his right hand in the face of his enemy. He has burned like a flaming fire in Jacob, consuming all around. He has bent his bow like an enemy, with his right hand set like a foe, and he has killed all who were delightful in our eyes, in the tent of the daughter of Zion. He has poured out his fury like fire. The Lord has become like an enemy. He has swallowed up Israel. He has swallowed up all its palaces. He has laid in ruins its strongholds. He has multiplied in the daughter of Judah mourning and lamentation. He has laid waste his booth like a garden, laid in ruins his meeting place. The Lord has made Zion forget festival and Sabbath, and in his fierce indignation has spurned king and priest. The Lord has scorned his altar, disowned his sanctuary. He's delivered into the hand of the enemy the walls of her palaces. They raised a clamor in the house of the Lord as on the day of festival. The Lord determined to lay in ruins the wall of the daughter of Zion. He stretched out the measuring line. He did not restrain his hand from destroying. He caused rampart and wall to lament. They languished together. Her gates have sunk into the ground. He has ruined and broken her bars. Her king and princes are among the nations. The law is no more, and her prophets find no vision from the Lord. The elders of the daughter of Zion sit on the ground in silence. They have thrown dust on their heads and put on sackcloth. The young women of Jerusalem have bowed their heads to the ground. My eyes are spent with weeping. My stomach churns. My bile is poured out on the ground because of the destruction of the daughter of my people. Because infants and babies faint in the streets of the city. They cry to their mothers, "Where is bread and wine?" As they faint like a wounded man in the streets of the city, as their life is poured out on their mother's bosom. What can I say for you? To what can I compare you, O daughter of Jerusalem? What can I liken to you, that I may comfort you, O virgin daughter of Zion? For your ruin is as vast as the sea. Who can heal you? Your prophets have seen for you false and deceptive visions. They have not exposed your iniquity to restore your fortunes, but have seen for you oracles that are false and misleading. All who pass along the way clap their hands at you. They hiss and wag their heads at the daughter of Jerusalem. Is this the city that was called the perfection of beauty, the joy of all the earth? All your enemies rail against you. They hiss, they gnash their teeth, they cry, "We have swallowed her." Ah, this is the day we have longed for. Now we have it. We see it. The Lord has done what he purposed. He has carried out his word which he commanded long ago. He is thrown down without pity. He has made the enemy rejoice over you and exalt the might of your foes. Their heart cried to the Lord, "O wall of the daughter of Zion, let tears stream down like a torrent day and night. Give yourself no rest, your eyes no respite. Arise, cry out in the night, at the beginning of the night watches. Pour out your heart like water before the presence of the Lord. Lift your hands to him for the lives of your children, who faint for hunger at the head of every street. Look, O Lord, and see, with whom have you dealt thus? Should women eat the fruit of their womb, the children of their tender care? Should priest and prophet be killed in the sanctuary of the Lord? In the dust of the streets lie the young and the old. My young women and my young men have fallen by the sword. You have killed them in the day of your anger, slaughtering without pity. You summoned, as if to a festival day, my terrors on every side. And on the day of the anger of the Lord, no one escaped or survived. Those whom I held and raised, my enemy destroyed. These are tough words to read, and especially the way that our lives often go, they're tough to understand as anything other than melodramatic, I think. But when we experience tragedy and loss, these words start to gain a little bit more meaning maybe than they would normally. And especially I think about these last three verses 20 to 22. It says, "Look, O Lord, and see. Should women eat the fruit of their womb, the children of their tender care?" We've heard about this in a handful of sieges in human history where people have had to eat human flesh just to survive. And it's just an ugly situation. There's no way around it. In the dust of the streets, it says in verse 21, "In the dust of the streets lie the young and the old. Young men and young women have fallen by the sword." And it addresses God. You have killed them in the day of your anger, slaughtering without pity. And just coming off of Palm Sunday, we have this gathering for a festival language. And in Israel's time, in Israel's faith and religious practice, they would gather 3 times a year for festivals, the whole country getting together in Jerusalem. And so it says you've summoned, you've gathered as if it was to a festival day. You've gathered my terrors on every side. Rather than the rejoicing of a festival day, it's the things that terrify us and make us afraid that have come on every side. No one has escaped. And these are the things that fell on God's people and God's city and God's temple. And it's this cry of the prophet to say, "God, where were you? Why have you abandoned us?" And of course, the answer comes back. Well, this is the justice of a just God against the sin of his people. And it's just this ugly, terrifying, mournful thing that we know it wasn't God's fault. His people sinned, and this is the just reward for sin. But God hasn't abandoned his people either. This reminds me of a story from, I forget what the movie's called, But there's Jews in a concentration camp in World War II. And there's a rabbi, and there's a couple of lawyers, and then some sort of, I think there's a couple farmers in there, a couple other just sort of random people, but they take on these different roles. They decide to put God on trial. Maybe that's what the movie's called, I think, God on Trial. But they put God on trial for crimes against humanity, crimes against the Jewish people, because they're being killed, and by the millions. They're being put into these camps. Their lives are just a total wreck at this point. And so they hold a mock trial for God, and they convict God of crimes against his own people, against the Jews. And so some of the younger guys especially get kind of excited at this point in the movie. And they say, all right, Rabbi, what do we do now? We've convicted God. We know he's guilty of bringing this tragedy upon our people. And the rabbi says, well, now we pray, because there's nothing else that we can do. And that's the same situation that Israel was in here in Lamentations. Yes, a righteous God brought this tragedy on them, against them because of their own sin. Yes, it's true in our situation as well, that God could stop this coronavirus. He could stop any tragedy that he wanted to if he so desired. And yet he sometimes lets tragedy befall us. He lets our lives fall to pieces. He has a bigger picture in mind, it's true. And he's a just and loving God, but we don't always see the justice the way that we would expect to, or the way that we want to. And yet the only option we have is to turn to God and rely on his mercy and his grace. Because we know that we don't deserve it. We know that all we deserve is tragedy. But for the sake of Jesus Christ, whose death and resurrection have paid for our sin, have made us right with the Father again, and reconciled us to our Lord, we say, O Lord, have mercy on us.